On the 6th of May, 1801, off the sun-bleached coast of Barcelona, a British naval officer made a decision that, by every stricture of naval logic and sanity, should have been his epitaph. He did not merely accept battle against a leviathan. He hunted it down. As we chart this course through history's most impossible odds, I invite you to subscribe to British History, ensuring these monuments of courage are never lost to the tide of time. To the naked eye, the scene unfolding upon that glassy Mediterranean swell was not a battle. It was a ritual execution. On one side lay the Spanish frigate El Gamo, a towering fortress of oak and iron, bristling with 32 heavy guns and manned by 319 souls. She was a predator of the deep, designed to shatter ships of the line and sweep the seas of British interference. On the other side, rolling uncomfortably in the frigate's shadow, bobbed His Majesty's sloop Speedy. She was a brig so diminutive, so comically undergunned, that her captain could carry her 4-pounder cannonballs in his coat pockets. She mounted 14 toy guns and carried a crew of merely 54 men. The mathematics of the engagement was stark, terrifying and absolute. The Spanish threw a broadside weight of 190 pounds. The British, a pitiful 28. By all conventional wisdom, the Speedy should have struck her colours before the first match was lit, or else been blown into matchwood within minutes. Yet, upon the quarterdeck of that tiny brig stood a tall red-headed Scotsman with a calm that bordered on the unnatural. Thomas Cochrane was not looking at the Spanish frigate with fear, but with a cold, predatory calculation. His crew, hardened men who had seen the worst of the French wars, looked to him not for comfort, but for the signal to engage. They knew what the Admiralty in London did not. They knew that their captain was not a man who gambled with their lives. He was a man who engineered chaos. Little did the Spanish know, peering down from their high gunwales at the insect-like ship approaching them, that they were not facing a fool. They were facing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where deception was deadlier than gunpowder, and where the rules of the Royal Navy were about to be rewritten in blood. The silence that stretches across the water before the first cannon fires is often heavier than the roar that follows. In that silence, one question hung heavy in the salt air. Why? Why would a rational commander steer his men into the mouth of a furnace? To understand the answer, and to understand the answer, and to understand why the Speedy did not turn and flee, we cannot simply look at the battle itself. We must look at the desperate, crumbling world that created Thomas Cochrane. We must rewind the clock to a moment when Britain stood alone against a continent set ablaze, and when the difference between survival and annihilation rested on the shoulders of men who refused to accept the impossible. The fuse was lit long before 1801. To comprehend the sheer madness of the duel between the Speedy and the El Gamo, we must first strip away the romantic varnish of the 19th century and confront the terrifying reality of the year 1801. It was, by any reasonable metric, the nadir of British fortunes, a moment when the island stood teetering on the precipice of total ruin. The grand alliances of the past had crumbled into dust. The Second Coalition, that vast web of monarchies constructed to cage the fire of the French Revolution, lay shattered on the battlefields of Marengo and Hohenlinden. Austria had been humbled. Russia had turned her back, and the smaller states of Europe were rapidly falling into the orbit of the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. To the citizens of London, looking anxiously across the narrow channel, the world seemed to be closing in. The map of Europe was being repainted in French tricolour, leaving Britain as the solitary flickering candle of resistance in a continent plunged into the twilight of hegemony. This was not a war of distant colonial skirmishes. It was a struggle for national survival that permeated every level of society. The fear of invasion was not a phantom. It was a daily conversation in the coffee houses of the city and the taverns of Portsmouth. The Corsican ogre was gathering his strength at Boulogne, and the only thing standing between the Grande Armée and the rolling hills of Kent were the weather-beaten ships of the Royal Navy. The wooden walls of England were stretched taut, a thin line of oak and canvas blockading a coastline that stretched from the frozen Baltic to the sweltering Levant. It was a task of impossible magnitude, requiring a constant, grinding vigilance that eroded men and ships alike. The Admiralty was desperate. They were running out of timber, running out of money, and most critically, they were running out of time. In the Mediterranean, the situation was particularly precarious. This sea was the soft underbelly of the French Empire, a vital theatre where Britain could still project power and harass the enemy's supply lines. But here, the Royal Navy faced not just the French, but their unwilling yet formidable allies, the Spanish. The Spanish Navy of 1801 is often dismissed by later historians as a decaying institution, a paper tiger rotting at anchor. This is a dangerous retrospective fallacy. While it is true that their officer corps lacked the aggressive, bloodthirsty initiative of the British, their ships were magnificent. The Spanish constructed some of the finest hulls in the world, colossal, stable gun platforms built of Havana cedar and mahogany that could absorb punishment that would shatter a British vessel. To the average British sailor, a Spanish warship was a prize to be coveted, but also a fortress to be feared. Within this high-stakes maritime chessboard, there existed a rigid hierarchy, a caste system of violence that everyone understood and respected. At the top were the ships of the line, the heavy battleships that fought in great formal lines of battle. Below them were the frigates. These were the eyes of the fleet, fast, heavily armed, and glamorous. A frigate captain was a prince of the sea, possessing the firepower to destroy anything smaller than himself and the speed to outrun anything larger. The Gamo, with her 32 guns and high freeboard, was a classic example of this breed, a purpose-built killer, designed to patrol the shipping lanes and crush resistance with impunity. And then, at the very bottom of the commissioned food chain, there were the brigs. Ships like HMS Speedy were never intended to stand in the line of battle. They were the errand boys of the Navy, the coastal couriers, the postmen. Small, cramped, and wet, they were generally commanded by lieutenants or junior commanders who had yet to prove themselves worthy of a real ship. In the brutal calculus of naval warfare, a brig did not fight a frigate. It was a matter of physics as much as doctrine. A frigate's deck stood high above the water, allowing her marines to fire down upon the exposed deck of a brig, turning it into a slaughterhouse. A frigate's timbers were thick enough to shrug off the light shot of a brig's guns, while a single broadside from the frigate could dismantle the smaller ship's structure, dismasting her or blowing her hull apart in a single catastrophic volley. For a brig to engage a frigate was not bravery, it was considered a species of professional suicide, a waste of His Majesty's property and human life. This was the suffocating orthodoxy that governed the war. The British Admiralty, for all its success, was a deeply conservative institution bound by the fighting instructions and a century of tradition. Officers were expected to do their duty, to hold the line, and to engage only when the odds were calculated and favourable. But the war against revolutionary France was not a war of tradition. It was an asymmetrical conflict against an enemy who rewrote the rules of engagement on land, mobilizing entire populations and moving armies with a speed that baffled the old generals of Austria and Prussia. Britain needed a response. The grim attrition of the blockade was not enough. The Royal Navy needed to strike terror into an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. They needed officers who were willing to discard the rulebook, men who understood that in a fight for survival, the only unforgivable sin is losing. Yet, the system was designed to weed out such men. The Royal Navy of the era was a strange paradox, a meritocracy of skill, certainly, but also a political labyrinth of patronage and influence. To get a good ship, one needed friends in high places, those who rocked the boat, who challenged their superiors, or who displayed an excess of eccentric genius were often shunted aside, left to rot on half pay, or given commands so insignificant that they could do no harm. It was a system that valued reliable competence over volatile brilliance. But as the year 1801 dawned, with the Baltic states turning hostile and the French grip tightening on the Mediterranean ports, the Admiralty found itself scraping the bottom of the barrel. They needed every hull that could float and every officer who could hold a telescope. It was into this gap, this desperate fissure in the British defences, that the Speedy was thrust. She was a vessel that nobody wanted, assigned to a station that was becoming a graveyard for reputations. The Mediterranean was a vast, unforgiving expanse where a lone ship could vanish without a trace, hunted by the potent frigates issuing from Barcelona and Cartagena. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Royal Navy lost control of these waters, the route to India, to the east, and to the very lifeblood of the British Empire would be threatened. The strategic imperative was clear. The enemy had to be contained, harassed, and terrified, regardless of the disparity in numbers. Little did the Lords of the Admiralty know that by assigning a troublesome, loud-mouthed, and politically inconvenient Scottish aristocrat to this floating coffin, they were inadvertently arming a weapon that would shatter the morale of the Spanish Navy. They viewed the Speedy as a liability, a negligible unit in a grand ledger of war. They did not realize that they had just given Thomas Cochrane exactly what he needed, a command too small to be micromanaged, in a sea too dangerous for caution. The stage was set for a collision between the rigid expectations of the past and the chaotic brilliance of the future, and the spark would be struck by a man who had been told time and time again that he was destined for nothing. History remembers Horatio Nelson as the saint of the Royal Navy, a man of delicate constitution, romantic temperament, and a martyr's death. But if Nelson was the Navy's soul, Thomas Cochrane was its sharp, jagged teeth. He was a creature of a different genus entirely, the sea-wolf, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his terrifying capacity for destruction and his inability to suffer fools. To understand the miracle of the Speedy, one must understand that Cochrane was not fighting solely for king and country. He was fighting a private war against a destiny that had tried to starve him out before he ever set foot on a quarterdeck. He was born into the aristocracy, but it was an aristocracy of ghosts and crumbling stone. His father, the 9th Earl of Dundonald, was a genius and a tragedy in equal measure, a man who burned through the family patrimony chasing scientific inventions and industrial revolutions that made fortunes for others but left the Cochranes in destitute penury. Thomas grew up in the draughty halls of Culross Abbey, surrounded by noble titles but lacking the coin to buy a decent coat. This singular upbringing forged a peculiar duality in the young Scot. From his father, he inherited a restless scientific mind that looked at the world not as it was, but as it could be engineered to be. But from the family's poverty, he inherited a desperate, clawing hunger for financial survival. He learned early that in the Georgian world, a title without money was merely a gilded cage. Consequently, when he joined the Navy, he did not do so as a pampered child of privilege. He entered late, at the age of 17, a sea daddy in the slang of the mess, surrounded by midshipmen barely out of the nursery. He was a giant of a man, 6 feet tall with flaming red hair and a broad Scottish brogue that instantly marked him as an outsider in the clipped, polished world of the English officer class. He was mocked for his age and his poverty, and he responded not with the sulking of a victim, but with the fists of a dockyard brawler. He fought his way to respect on the lower deck, learning the ropes with a physical intensity that shocked his superiors. But while his shipmates spent their off hours gambling or drinking, Cochrane was in the hold, studying the geometry of sails, the chemistry of gunpowder, and the physics of hull displacement. He was becoming that most dangerous of things, a warrior who thought like a scientist. This intellectual arrogance, however, came with a price. Cochrane possessed a fatal flaw that would haunt him from the Mediterranean to the coasts of Chile. He could not keep his mouth shut in the presence of incompetence. In a navy built on the bedrock of unthinking obedience, Cochrane was a compulsive improver. He saw inefficiency as a personal insult. If a superior officer gave a foolish order, Cochrane would not only question it, he would prove mathematically why it was absurd. This trait did not endear him to the Admiralty. He was viewed as difficult, a radical, a man who perhaps thought a little too much for the good of the service. His most formidable antagonist was not a Frenchman, but the First Lord of the Admiralty himself, Earl St. Vincent. St. Vincent was a titan of the old-school, rigid, disciplinarian, and deeply suspicious of officers who lacked political tact. To St. Vincent, Cochrane was a chaotic element, a man who prioritized effectiveness over protocol. Their relationship was one of cold, mutual loathing. Cochrane, desperate for a chance to restore his family's fortune through prize money, and St. Vincent seemingly determined to bury this insolent Scot in the darkest corners of the fleet. It was this friction that led to his appointment to the Speedy. It was not a reward for his evident skill. It was a test and perhaps a punishment. In the year 1800, giving a man like Cochrane command of a brig like the Speedy was the naval equivalent of putting a racehorse to work pulling a coal cart. The vessel was a notorious joke within the fleet. She was slow, she was wet, and she was dangerously fragile. But the Admiralty had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that by giving him a bad ship, they would limit his ambition. They failed to realize that they had just handed a master engineer a blank canvas. Cochrane stepped aboard the Speedy and saw what others had missed. He saw that her small size, which everyone else viewed as a death sentence, was actually her greatest asset. She was invisible at night, maneuverable in the shallows, and could be handled by a handful of men. He didn't see a floating coffin. He saw a guerrilla fighter. With the desperation of a man who knows this is his only shot at redemption and the intellect of a scientist solving a complex equation, he began to transform the ship. He was about to take a vessel that had no business fighting a war and turn it into the most feared predator in the Mediterranean. But before he could hunt, he had to ensure his own ship wouldn't kill him first. To describe HMS Speedy as a warship was, in the year 1800, an exercise in generous exaggeration. In the brutal vernacular of the Portsmouth dockyards, she was known simply as a coffin brig, a term that carried more prophecy than affection. She was a vessel of merely 158 tons, a speck of timber upon the ocean that seemed designed by a committee of men who had never seen the sea. When Thomas Cochrane first stepped onto her quarterdeck, he did not feel the swell of pride that usually accompanies a first command. He felt the cramping constraints of a cage. The physical dimensions of the Speedy were a standing joke in the Mediterranean fleet. Cochrane himself, a man of imposing stature standing well over 6 feet, found that the ceiling of his own cabin was only 5 feet high. To perform the morning ritual of shaving, he was forced to slide open the skylight and thrust his head out onto the quarterdeck, using the deck itself as a toilet table, much to the amusement of the passing crew. It was a daily humiliation that served as a constant reminder of his lowly status. But if the accommodation was uncomfortable, the armament was farcical. The ship was pierced for 14 guns, but these were 4-pounders, diminutive pieces of ordnance that fired an iron ball no larger than a clenched fist. Cochrane, with his characteristic dry wit, later remarked that he could walk the deck with a broadside of ammunition stuffed into his coat pockets. Against the heavy oak ribs of a French or Spanish frigate, these projectiles would have no more effect than hailstones against a castle wall. A lesser man would have looked at this floating mockery, penned a letter of complaint to the Admiralty, and resigned himself to a career of convoy duty and mediocrity. But Cochrane was an engineer in an admiral's coat. He understood that in war, the machine is only as effective as the mind that drives it. If the Speedy could not win by brute force, she would have to win by speed and guile. He immediately set about tormenting the dockyard officials at Port Mahon. He demanded a new main yard, the great spar that holds the principal sail, to increase the brig's speed. He requested the fore-top-gallant yard of the Genre, a captured French 74. The commissioner of the dockyard laughed in his face, telling him the spar was far too large for such a tiny brig. Cochrane, undeterred, had the spar planned down at his own expense until it looked smaller, then hoisted it anyway. The result was a ship that was dangerously over-canvassed, but terrifyingly fast. However, speed alone would not save them from the predators of the coast. Cochrane knew that if he were ever cornered by a frigate, his 4-pounders would be useless. He needed a weapon that the Admiralty could not issue: deception. He realized that the greatest weakness of the Spanish Navy was not their ships, but their caution. They feared the unknown. And so, Cochrane turned the Speedy into a piece of theatre. He obtained the paint scheme of a Danish brig, Denmark being a neutral power at the time, and had the Speedy painted to match. He hired a Danish quartermaster and outfitted him in a convincing uniform. He even went so far as to secure Danish documentation. The Speedy ceased to be a British warship. To any telescope watching from the horizon, she was the innocent merchant brig Cloma, plodding her harmless way through the war zone. This transformation went beyond mere cosmetics. It seeped into the very soul of the crew. The 54 men under his command were a mixed bag of pressed men and volunteers, the usual sweepings of the port. Yet, under Cochrane's tutelage, they began to change. He drilled them, not with a lash, but with the promise of gold. He explained the physics of their gunnery, how, because their guns were so small, they had to be fired with a speed and precision that defied belief. They practiced elevating the guns, depressing them, and firing until their hands bled, and their timing was clockwork. He taught them that their survival depended on the audacities of their captain, and in return, he gave them a sense of invincibility. They were no longer sailing in a coffin, they were sailing in a trap, and the rest of the Mediterranean was the prey. Little did the Spanish know, as they scanned the horizon for the white ensign of the Royal Navy, that the most dangerous ship in the water looked like a harmless neutral trader. Cochrane had taken a vessel that was physically incapable of fighting a traditional war and redesigned it for a war of nerves. He had stripped away the rigid orthodoxy of the line of battle and replaced it with the fluid, ruthless pragmatism of the guerrilla. The Speedy was ready. The stage was set, and as the prow of the brig cut through the phosphorescent waters of the Spanish coast, the hunter was about to test his disguise against the deadliest eyes in the enemy fleet. Once the transformation of the Speedy was complete, Thomas Cochrane did not merely patrol the Mediterranean. He stalked it. The brig, now a wolf in sheep's clothing, slipped seamlessly into the bustling traffic of the Spanish coast. For the merchants of Barcelona and the supply captains running the blockade, the sea became a place of paranoia. A ship would appear on the horizon, flying the neutral flag of Denmark or an American ensign, plodding along with the harmless lethargy of a trader. But the moment the distance closed, the false flag would drop, the ports would fly open, and the Speedy would reveal her teeth. In the span of a few short weeks, Cochrane captured vessel after vessel, disrupting the coastal trade with a veracity that bordered on industrial. The crew, once a ragtag assembly of the unwilling, began to calculate their prize money in sums that exceeded a lifetime of labor on the docks. They were no longer just sailors, they were accomplices in a grand, profitable larceny. However, the sea is a cruel theatre, and the line between hunter and hunted is often drawn in shifting water. The true test of Cochrane's modifications came not when he was the aggressor, but when the trap finally snapped shut around him. It happened on a breathless, glassy morning when the Speedy, prowling far too close to the enemy shore, found herself under the shadow of a Spanish frigate. This was no merchant prize. This was a warship, swift and heavily armed, surging forward with the weather gauge in her favor. Escape was a physical impossibility. The Speedy was over-canvassed and fast, yes, but she could not outrun a frigate on this point of sail, and she certainly could not fight her. The British crew froze. They looked to the quarterdeck, expecting the order to clear for action, or perhaps the humiliating command to strike the colours and surrender. Instead, Cochrane ordered the Danish colours hoisted. He summoned his Danish quartermaster to the rail, dressed in the uniform they had so carefully prepared. As the Spanish frigate loomed large, her guns run out and her officers scrutinizing the tiny brig through their telescopes, Cochrane played his masterstroke. He knew that the Spanish were brave, but he also knew they were deeply religious and terrified of the unseen killers of the era. Disease. The plague was ravaging the North African coast, a spectral horror that turned men's blood to water. As the Spanish boat was lowered to board and inspect their papers, a procedure that would instantly reveal the British guns, and the ruse Cochrane ordered the quarantine flag, a patch of sickly yellow bunting, to be run up the mast. The Speedy sat motionless, a pariah on the water. When the Spanish boat drew within hailing distance, the Danish quartermaster shouted across the gap in his native tongue, explaining that they were 2 days out from Algiers, a city currently festering with the plague. The reaction was visceral. The Spanish sailors in the cutter stopped rowing as if they had hit a wall. To board a plague ship was not an act of war, it was a death sentence for the entire fleet. The Spanish officer, holding a handkerchief to his face, waved them away with a mixture of terror and relief, wishing them a safe voyage and a distant one. The frigate wore round and sailed away, fleeing a phantom infection, while the crew of the Speedy stood on the deck, barely daring to breathe. Then a roar of laughter erupted. They had defeated a 30-gun warship without lighting a single match. In that moment, the bond between Cochrane and his men was sealed with iron. They realized that their captain possessed a weapon far more potent than the Admiralty's 4-pounders. He possessed an imagination that could bend reality to his will. They began to believe that as long as Lord Koch was on the quarterdeck, they were invincible. They would have sailed into the mouth of hell if he had told them there was prize money to be had in the inferno. But this campaign of humiliation could not last forever. The Spanish Naval Command was not composed of fools, and their patience was eroding with every prize Cochrane towed into Port Mahon. The Speedy had become more than a nuisance. She was a stinging insult to the honour of the Spanish flag. The disruption to the coastal trade was starving the garrisons and bleeding the merchants dry. Reports filtered back to the Spanish Admiralty of a small, nondescript brig that vanished like smoke and fought like a demon. They realized that standard patrols were insufficient. To catch a wolf, one does not send a shepherd, one sends a hunter. In the first days of May, the order went out from the highest levels of the Spanish Naval Command. The predation of the Speedy was to be ended permanently. They selected one of their finest jet frigates, the El Gamo. She was a magnificent vessel, commanded by Don Francisco de Lorme, a brave and capable officer. She was fitted out with a specific purpose, to hunt down Thomas Cochrane. She carried over 300 men, 6 times the crew of the Speedy, and was armed with heavy 12-pounder-long guns and colossal 32-pounder carronades. She was a sledgehammer forged to crush a walnut. The Spanish believed they had calculated every variable. They had the tonnage, the firepower, and the manpower. They knew the Speedy was a pest, a lightly armed brig that relied on running away. They assumed that once cornered, the British rat would have no choice but to surrender. Little did they know, as the El Gamo weighed anchor and turned her prow toward the open sea, that they were operating on a fatal misconception. They believed they were hunting a fugitive. They did not realize that the creature they sought was not trying to escape. Thomas Cochrane was not interested in survival. He was interested in glory. And as the two ships drew inexorably closer on the vast indifference of the Mediterranean, the Spanish were about to discover that they had not trapped the Speedy. The Speedy had been waiting for them. The dawn of May the 6th, 1801, broke over the Mediterranean with a clarity that seemed to mock the dirty business of war. The sea was a sheet of hammered copper, the wind light and variable, barely enough to ripple the canvas. Off the coast of Barcelona, the Speedy was doing what she always did, hunting. At first light, a sail was spotted on the horizon, a large vessel, seemingly lumbering and vulnerable. To the prize-hungry crew of the Speedy, this was breakfast. They crowded the rail, calculating their shares, anticipating another easy capture of a fat merchantman. But as the distance closed, the atmosphere on the deck shifted from avarice to a cold, creeping dread. The stranger did not turn away. She did not crowd on sail to escape. Instead, she altered course, turning her prow directly toward the little brig. As she heeled over in the light breeze, her gun ports flew open in a domino effect of terrifying synchronization. One by one, the black muzzles of heavy artillery were run out, scarring the wooden flank of the ship. This was no merchantman. This was the El Gamo. The trap had been sprung. The hunter found himself staring down the throat of the wolf he had been tormenting for months. The Spanish frigate loomed out of the water like a castle, her 32 guns creating a wall of iron that promised absolute annihilation. On the deck of the Speedy, the silence was absolute. Every sailor knew the arithmetic of the grave. They were staring at a vessel that outweighed them 4 times over, with a broadside that could pulverize their brig into splinters in a single volley. The plague flag ruse would not work twice. The Spanish were at quarters, their matches lit, their intent unmistakable. Panic, cold and sharp, began to take hold. Eyes turned to the quarterdeck, looking for the inevitable order to surrender. To strike the colours was no shame in such a situation. It was the rational act of a sane commander, preserving the lives of his men against a force of nature. But Thomas Cochrane did not look at the El Gamo with the eyes of a victim. He looked at her with the eyes of an engineer assessing a structural flaw. He saw the high, towering sides of the Spanish ship. He saw the heavy swell of the sea rolling the frigate from side to side, and he saw something else, a geometric possibility that no other officer in the Royal Navy would have dared to entertain. He turned to his crew, his face a mask of Scottish granite, and delivered a speech that has echoed down the corridors of naval history for its sheer, understated dryness. He did not speak of glory or King George. He simply gestured to the leviathan bearing down on them and said, "My lads, you must either take this ship or be taken yourselves. Hardships are to be expected." It was a statement of fact, devoid of melodrama, yet it grounded the men. It shifted their focus from the terror of dying to the mechanics of fighting. Cochrane knew that to run was death. The Gamo was fresh out of port and fast, and her bow chasers alone would tear the Speedy apart long before she could reach the safety of the horizon. They had to fight, but how does a fly fight a hammer? Cochrane ordered the American flag hoisted, a final, fleeting moment of deception to confuse the Spanish captain Don Francisco de Lorme for just a few vital minutes. As the Speedy closed the distance, the Spanish hesitated, wary of firing on a neutral vessel. In that hesitation, Cochrane gained the most precious commodity in war: distance. He ordered the helm over, steering not away from the enemy, but directly at her. This was the moment of scientific warfare. Cochrane had calculated the ballistics of the engagement with a terrifying precision. He knew that at long range, the Spanish 12-pounders and massive 32-pounder carronades would destroy him. A single hit to the waterline would sink the Speedy. A single hit to the waterline would leave her drifting and helpless. Distance was his enemy. His only safety, paradoxically, lay in the one place no sane sailor would go: directly alongside the enemy hull. As the Speedy surged forward, the American flag was hauled down and the British ensign ran up. The ruse was over. The Gamo erupted. A sheet of flame ripped along her side as her broadside thundered out. The noise was deafening, a physical blow that shook the air. The sea around the Speedy was torn into white geysers of foam, but miraculously the brig emerged from the smoke largely unscathed. The Spanish, firing from their high deck, had sent their shot howling over the low masts of the British ship. They had fired on the downward roll, but the Speedy was too small, too close, and too low in the water. Cochrane held his fire. His men stood by their tiny 4-pounders, the matches burning down, sweat stinging their eyes. They screamed for permission to fire, to release the tension that was coiling in their chests, but Cochrane waited. He stood by the rail, watching the Spanish hull grow larger and larger until it blocked out the sun. He needed to be closer. He needed to be so close that he could smell the tar on the enemy's hull. He was steering his ship into the dead zone, a geometrical blind spot where the Spanish guns, mounted high on the frigate's bulwarks, could not be depressed low enough to hit him. It was a game of chicken played with cannonballs. If he turned too soon, he would be raked and destroyed. If he waited too long, the Spanish Marines in the fighting tops would pick off his crew like ducks in a barrel. The Speedy cut through the water, closing the gap. 200 yards. 100 yards. 50. The Spanish fired again, and again the shots screamed overhead, shredding the rigging but missing the hull. The Gamo was a giant trying to swat a wasp, but the wasp was moving too fast. Finally, with a crash of timber that threw men off their feet, the Speedy slammed against the side of the Gamo. Cochrane gave the order. The yards of the two ships locked together, tangling in a chaotic embrace of rope and canvas. The little brig was now tucked neatly under the armpit of the giant, so close that the Spanish cannon muzzles were actually protruding over the Speedy's deck. In that instant, the silence returned, heavier than before. The Spanish gunners looked down, confused. They could not lower their cannons any further. Their own hull was in the way. They were armed with the most powerful artillery in the Mediterranean, and they were rendered impotent by simple geometry. Cochrane looked up at the towering wooden wall of the enemy ship, grinned and gave the signal. The Speedy's guns, loaded with double and treble charges of grape and shot, were elevated to their maximum. They weren't aiming at the hull, They were aiming up straight through the main deck of the unsuspecting Spaniard. Little did the crew of the El Gamo know, the floor beneath their feet was about to erupt. The impact was not a collision of equals, it was the jarring thud of a parasite latching onto its host. As the yards of HMS Speedy entangled with the rigging of the El Gamo, the two vessels became locked in a grotesque wooden embrace. For a moment, the world seemed to suspend its breath. The British sailors, stripped to the waist and blackened with grime, looked straight up at the towering, cliff-like side of the Spanish frigate. They were so close they could see the grain of the enemy's hull. They could hear the confused shouting of the Spanish officers on the deck above. They could smell the pungent, tarred aroma of the enemy ship. Then the order came, not a shout, but a sharp, cutting command that unleashed hell. The Speedy's 14 tiny 4-pounders, elevated to their absolute limit, erupted in unison. They did not fire into the solid oak of the Spanish waterline, where their shot would have harmlessly embedded itself. Instead, Cochrane had directed them to fire upwards, through the thin timber of the main deck, and into the crowded mass of the Spanish crew. The effect was catastrophic. The trebled-shotted charge's canister, grape, and round shot packed together tore through the floorboards of the El Gamo with the violence of a volcanic eruption. On the Spanish deck, the scene was one of sudden, incomprehensible horror. The floor beneath their feet simply disintegrated, sending a spray of wooden splinters and iron hail shredding through the ranks of the gun crews. Men who had been bracing themselves to fire a broadside found themselves cut down from below by an enemy they could not even see. It was a masterstroke of geometric violence. Cochrane had turned the El Gamo's own size against her. By tucking himself beneath the curve of her hull, he had placed the Speedy in the eye of the storm, a sanctuary of physics, where the enemy's strength became their greatest liability. The Spanish response was immediate and furious. The roar of their massive 12-pounders and 32-pounder carronades shattered the air. To an observer on the distant coast, it must have looked as though the Speedy had been annihilated, swallowed whole by a cloud of white smoke and flame. But on the water, a miracle of ballistics was unfolding. The Spanish gunners, frantic to destroy the pest clinging to their flank, depressed their breeches as high as they would go, trying to angle their muzzles down. But it was not enough. The Speedy was too low. The Spanish broadside, a storm of iron capable of sinking a ship of the line, screamed harmlessly over the heads of the British crew. The wind of the passing shot ruffled the hair of the topmen and severed the rigging, sending ropes coiling down to the deck like severed snakes. But the hull remained untouched. For the next hour, this dance of death continued, a surreal, suspended agony of noise and smoke. It was a battle fought in a telephone booth. The British loaded and fired, their little guns acting like chainsaws cutting into the belly of the beast. Cochrane prowled the quarterdeck, his eyes darting from the rigging to the smoke-shrouded rail of the enemy. He was a conductor of a symphony of destruction, calculating angles and reload times with the cold detachment of a mathematician. But the Spanish were not cowards. They were the inheritors of a naval tradition that stretched back to the Armada, and they would not be mocked by a toy boat. Realizing that their great guns were useless, the Spanish captain, Don Francisco de Lorme, ordered his men to the rails. If they could not sink the Speedy, they would sweep her deck clean with musketry. The battle shifted instantly from a duel of artillery to a close-quarters firefight. Hundreds of Spanish marines and sailors crowded the bulwarks of the El Gamo, raining lead down upon the exposed deck of the brig. This was the vulnerability Cochrane had feared. The Speedy had no cover. She was an open basket. British sailors began to fall, their bodies thudding against the blood-slicked planks. The surgeon, operating in the cramping darkness of the tiny cockpit below, was soon overwhelmed. The Spanish saw their advantage. A roar went up from the frigate à la bordage. Boarders away! They began to mass at the rail, a sea of pikes and cutlasses preparing to flood down onto the brig and drown the British in sheer numbers. The disparity was terrifying, 300 men against barely 50. If the Spanish boots touched the British deck, the battle was over. Here, Cochrane displayed the tactical fluidity that would define his legend. He did not wait for the wave to break. he shouted to the helmsman. The Speedy sheered off just a few yards, creating a gap of churning water between the ships. The Spanish boarders, poised to leap, faltered. In that moment of hesitation, the Speedy's guns, reloaded with grape, swept the Spanish rail clear. It was a scythe cutting through wheat. The boarding party was shattered before it could launch. Then, before the Spanish could run out their heavy guns to utilize the new distance, Cochrane slammed the Speedy back against the hull of the frigate, locking them once more in the deadly clinch. He did this not once, but twice. It was a manoeuvre of breathtaking audacity, a peekaboo warfare that relied on split-second timing. Each time the Spanish gathered to board, Cochrane pulled away to slaughter them. Each time they ran to their cannons, he closed the distance to safety. He was playing a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse was manipulating the cat. Yet despite this tactical brilliance, the clock was ticking against them. The attrition was unsustainable. The Speedy had lost men. The rigging was shredded, the sails hanging in tatters. The heat of the Mediterranean sun, combined with the suffocating smoke of the gunpowder, was draining the strength of the British crew. They were fighting with the desperate energy of the damned. Faces blackened, hands blistered, deafened by the relentless concussions. Cochrane looked at his men. He saw the fatigue etching deep lines into their soot-stained faces. He knew that the dance could not last forever. The Spanish were confused, yes, and they had taken heavy casualties, but they still possessed a reserve of manpower that was effectively inexhaustible compared to his own. Eventually, a stray musket ball would find Cochrane's heart, or a lucky grenade would land in the Speedy's magazine, or the Spanish would simply swarm over the side regardless of the grape shot, driven by the shame of being held at bay by a dwarf. The equilibrium of the battle was shifting. The Spanish fire from the tops was becoming more accurate. The sheer weight of metal and men was beginning to tell. The Speedy was a boxer who had dodged 100 blows, but she was tiring, and the giant only needed to land one. It was then that Cochrane made the calculation that separates a good officer from a great one. He realized that survival was no longer an option. Passive defense, however brilliant, would result in inevitable defeat. The impossible odds could not be managed. They had to be broken. He looked up at the towering side of the Gamo, a wooden wall that had terrified navies for a generation. Logic dictated that he should cut his losses, try to maim the enemy's rigging, and limp away into the smoke. But logic had no place on the deck of the Speedy. Cochrane turned to his remaining crew, less than 40 men standing now, and saw the question in their eyes. They were waiting for the end. Instead, he gave them a new beginning. He realized that the Spanish were demoralized by the unseen carnage coming from below, but they were comforted by the fact that they were the ones looking down. To break them, he had to invert the psychological hierarchy of the battle. He had to go up. He signaled to the doctor, Mr. Guthrie, a man whose hands were stained with the blood of his shipmates. "Take the wheel, doctor," Cochrane said, his voice cutting through the din. The surgeon, bewildered but obedient, took the helm. This left every single fighting man free. Cochrane drew his sword. It was a rusted, heavy thing, much like the ship he commanded. He didn't order them to reload. He pointed to the enemy rail, towering high above their heads. The stalemate of physics had run its course. The mathematical miracle had bought them an hour of life, but it could not buy them victory. For that they needed something primal. They were about to leave the safety of their blind spot and climb straight into the kill zone. Little did the Spanish know, as they regrouped for another boarding attempt, that the rats were not scurrying away. They were coming up the walls. The decision to board was not a tactical evolution. It was a descent into madness. In the annals of naval warfare, the boarder is usually the prerogative of the strong. The heavy frigate running alongside the crippled sloop. The swarm of marines overwhelming a merchantman. For a crew of 40 exhausted, blood-soaked men to assault a fortress manned by over 300 is a proposition that belongs in the realm of mythology, not history. Yet, as Thomas Cochrane wiped the soot from his eyes and looked at his men, he saw that the madness had taken hold. They were no longer sailors of the Royal Navy, bound by the King's regulations. They were survivors of an hour-long Holocaust. and in their desperate eyes, the only way out of the fire was to climb into the source of it. The preparations were swift and grotesque. There was no time for speeches, no time for the polishing of buttons or the straightening of uniforms. Cochrane ordered his men to blacken their faces with the grease and gunpowder soot that coated the deck of the Speedy. This was not merely camouflage. It was psychological warfare of the most primal kind. He knew the Spanish were superstitious, devout Catholics who feared the infernal. He intended to board their ship not as British tars, but as demons rising from the smoke of the underworld. It was a theatrical flourish, a calculation that terror could bridge the gap where numbers failed. The final arrangement of the ship was an act of supreme trust. Cochrane turned to the ship's surgeon, Mr. Guthrie, a man whose trade was the amputation of limbs and the binding of wounds, not the steering of a brig of war. "Doctor," Cochrane said, handing over the wheel, "you are the only man left. If we fail, you know what to do." Guthrie stood alone on the quarterdeck, the sole guardian of the Speedy, watching as every other able-bodied soul, including the ship's boys, armed themselves with cutlasses, boarding pikes, and pistols. The emptiness of the Speedy's deck was a haunting symbol of the gamble. Behind them lay nothing but an empty shell. Ahead lay everything. The plan was a pincer movement designed to shatter the enemy's concentration. Cochrane split his tiny force. Half would attack the bow, screaming like banshees to draw the Spanish forward. The other half, led by Cochrane himself, would scale the waist, the center of the ship, attacking from the rear of the crowd. It was a classic diversion, but executed with a margin of error measured in inches. At the signal, the British swarmed up the side of the Gamo. They climbed the tangled rigging, hauled themselves over the hammock nettings, and vaulted onto the Spanish deck. The scene that greeted the first wave of Spanish defenders at the bow was straight from a nightmare. Out of the billowing, acrid clouds of gun smoke emerged figures with faces of pure obsidian, eyes white and wild, screaming with a ferocity that defied their numbers. The Spanish forward guard, expecting disciplined British Marines in red coats, recoiled in genuine horror. For a fleeting second, the disciplined lines of the Spanish infantry wavered. They fired their muskets, but the aim was hasty, shaken by the apparition before them. In that fracture of time, Cochrane and the main force crested the rail at the waist. They did not pause to form a line. They hit the Spanish flank with the force of a tidal wave. The deck of the Gamo became a slaughterhouse of confusion. The air was thick with the screams of men, the clash of steel on steel, and the deafening crack of pistol shots fired at point-blank range. The British, fighting with the frenzied energy of men who know they are dead if they stop moving, carved a path into the mass of the enemy. But the mathematics of the engagement began to reassert their cold logic. The shock of the demons lasted only moments. The Spanish officers, recovering their wits, saw that these were flesh and blood men, and very few of them at that. They rallied their troops. "Stand fast, drive them back." The cry went up, and the sheer weight of the Spanish crew began to press the British back against the rail. The momentum was shifting. Cochrane, parrying a thrust from a Spanish pike, realized that the adrenaline was fading. His men were being surrounded. They were 40 specks of dust in a storm of 300. They were fighting bravely, magnificently, but they were losing. The deck was slippery with blood, the footing treacherous. A British sailor would cut down one opponent only to find 3 more stepping into his place. The Spanish Marines, positioned on the quarterdeck and forecastle, began to fire down into the melee with disciplined precision. The trap was closing. Cochrane saw his first lieutenant, Parker, fighting back-to-back with a bosun's mate, their circle of defense shrinking by the second. The impossible odds were no longer a narrative device. They were a closing coffin lid. It was here, on the brink of total annihilation, that Cochrane played his final and most audacious card. He realized that he could not win the physical battle. He had to win the mind of the enemy commander. Amidst the roar of the combat, Cochrane noticed the Spanish colours, the great red and gold flag still flying proudly above the chaos. As long as that flag flew, the Spanish believed they were winning. They believed their structure of command held firm. Fighting his way to the rail, Cochrane looked not at the enemy in front of him, but past them, towards the main hatchway where the Spanish reserve crew was waiting to surge up. He took a breath, filling his lungs with the copper-tasting air, and shouted in fluent Spanish, his voice booming over the din of the battle. He did not scream a challenge. He screamed a lie. The officers have surrendered. They have struck the flag. Lay down your arms. Simultaneously, he signalled to one of his men near the halyards. The British sailor slashed the rope. The massive Spanish ensign, the symbol of the King of Spain's authority, fluttered and collapsed, drifting down to the blood-stained deck like a dying bird. The effect was instantaneous and electric. The Spanish sailors, fighting in the waist, heard the shout. They looked up and saw the empty sky where their flag had been a moment before. In the confusion of the smoke and the terror of the demons, they did not pause to verify who had given the order or who had cut the rope. They saw the result. In the rigid hierarchy of naval discipline, the striking of the colours is the absolute end. To fight on after the flag is down is mutiny. It is murder. The hesitation that rippled through the Spanish ranks was the domino effect in its purest form. The man at the front lowered his sword, uncertain. The man behind him saw the sword lower and assumed the surrender was genuine. The reserves below decks, hearing the commotion and the cease of fire, stayed put. The Spanish captain, Don Francisco de Lorme, had fallen earlier in the charge, and in the vacuum of leadership, Cochrane's voice became the only authority on the ship. The roar of battle died away, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. It was a silence more deafening than the cannons. On the heaving deck of the El Gamo, a surreal tableau froze in time. 40 battered, panting British sailors, their blackened faces streaked with sweat and blood, stood surrounded by nearly 300 armed Spanish seamen. The Spanish could have rushed them. They could have thrown them into the sea with a single collective heave. But the psychological spell was absolute. They had been convinced of their own defeat before it had physically happened. The Spanish officers, realizing too late the trick that had been played, looked at their men, but the spirit had broken. The will to fight is a fragile porcelain, and Cochrane had shattered it. One by one, the Spanish cutlasses clattered to the deck. Pistols were uncocked and lowered. Hands were raised. Cochrane stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his sword arm trembling from exertion. He watched as the Spanish crew began to be herded below decks. It was a logistical nightmare. There were more prisoners than there were British sailors to guard them. He had to station his men at the hatchways with loaded blunderbusses and swivel guns pointed down into the hold, grimly warning the captives that any attempt to retake the ship would result in a massacre. It was a bluff, of course. If the Spanish had rushed the deck, the British would have been overrun in seconds. But the bluff held. As the smoke finally cleared and the Mediterranean sun beat down on the carnage, the true scale of the accomplishment began to dawn on the victors. The British looked around the vast expanse of the El Gamo's deck. They looked at the heavy guns they had silenced, the hundreds of prisoners they had taken, and then they looked back at their own tiny ship, the Speedy, still bobbing faithfully alongside. The disparity was comical. It was as if a terrier had dragged down a stag. This was not merely a victory. It was a subversion of reality. They had lost only 3 men killed and 8 wounded. The Spanish had lost 14 killed and 41 wounded. The Spanish had lost 14 killed and 41 wounded, a casualty list that exceeded the entire crew of the Speedy. Cochrane had achieved the impossible, not through divine intervention, but through a ruthless application of psychology, geometry, and sheer, unadulterated nerve. He had turned the Spanish mind against itself. But as the adrenaline faded and the pain of their wounds began to throb, a new emotion settled over the crew. It was not triumph, but a strange, hollow disbelief. They were alive. Against all the odds that the world, the Admiralty, and common sense had stacked against them, they were alive, and their captain, the tall Scotsman now quietly issuing orders to secure the prize, was not just a commander to them anymore. He was a warlock of the sea, a man who could rewrite the laws of probability. Little did they know, as they set a course for Port Mahon with their prize towing sluggishly behind them, that the battle for the El Gamo was over. But the battle for the truth was just beginning. They had won the glory, but in the halls of London, glory is a currency that often buys nothing but envy. The greatest enemy Thomas Cochrane would face was not the 300 men he had just defeated, but the bitter, jealous old men waiting for him at home. When the HMS Speedy limped back into the harbour of Port Mahon, she did not merely return, she made an entrance that bordered on the theatrical. Trailing in her wake, like a conquered giant led by a child, was the El Gamo. The sight was so preposterous that the harbour-master reportedly rubbed his eyes, unable to reconcile the tonnage of the prize with the diminutive size of the captor. The waterfront erupted. Sailors, dockworkers and soldiers crowded the quays, cheering the return of the Sea-Wolf. In the eyes of the fleet, Thomas Cochrane was a god. He had proven that British steel and Scottish nerve were superior to any mathematics the enemy could devise, but as the cheers faded and the reports were dispatched to London, Cochrane was about to discover a bitter truth. The Admiralty does not reward geniuses, it tolerates them, and only barely. In the hallowed, oak-panelled offices of Whitehall, the news of the capture was received not with jubilation but with a frigid, aristocratic silence. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Earl St. Vincent, was a man whose blood ran cold with the protocols of the past. To him, Cochrane was not a hero. He was a dangerous disruption. Cochrane was loud, he was politically radical, and worst of all, he was right. The conflict crystallized over a point of honor that reveals the true measure of Cochrane as a man. It was customary, following a victory of such magnitude, for the first lieutenant of the victorious ship to be promoted. Cochrane's Lieutenant Parker had been severely wounded leading the boarding party. He had bled for this victory. Cochrane wrote to St. Vincent, expecting the automatic promotion of his subordinate. St. Vincent refused. His reasoning was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. He claimed that the number of officers killed on board the Speedy was too small to justify a promotion, because Cochrane had saved his men's lives through brilliance rather than spending them in a blundering attrition. His victory was deemed insufficiently bloody. Cochrane's reaction was immediate and suicidal. He did not swallow the insult. He dipped his quill in venom and wrote a reply to the First Lord that effectively ended his naval career. He pointed out, with devastating statistical accuracy, that fewer men had died on board St. Vincent's own flagship during the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, for which the Earl had received his title, than had been casualties on the Speedy. He essentially told the most powerful man in the Royal Navy that he was a hypocrite who had been rewarded for a battle where he had risked less than a lieutenant on a brig. The silence from London was deafening. The revenge was slow, administrative and absolute. Parker was eventually promoted, but years too late to save his broken career. As for Cochrane, the Sea-Wolf was leashed. He was stripped of the Speedy. Instead of being given a frigate worthy of his talents, he was assigned to the HMS Arab. This was not a ship, it was a floating prison. The Arab was a converted collier, slow, rotting and ungainly, often described as sailing like a haystack. Worse, he was sent to patrol the fishing grounds of the Orkney Islands, a desolate, wind-swept station where there were no French, no Spanish, and absolutely no glory. The message was clear. The establishment would rather waste a genius than suffer an insurgent. They tried to bury Thomas Cochrane in the grey mists of the North Sea, hoping the world would forget the man who captured a frigate with a brig. But true brilliance is a fire that cannot be smothered by administrative paperwork. They had taken his shit, but they could not take his legacy, and little did the grey men of Whitehall know that by casting him out, they were ensuring that his name would survive long after their own had crumbled into dust. The capture of the El Gamo was more than a singular miracle of violence. It was a revelation that rippled through the marrow of the Royal Navy. In an era obsessed with line-of-battle rigidities and the sheer weight of metal, Thomas Cochrane proved that the most dangerous weapon on the ocean was not a cannon, but the human mind. He demonstrated that initiative, when coupled with a scientific disregard for the impossible, could shatter the established laws of warfare. The tactical blueprint he drafted on the deck of the Speedy would echo through the decades. influencing a generation of officers who realized that a British ship was never truly outgunned as long as it remained afloat. Yes, perhaps the greatest irony of Cochrane's life is that his reality was far too implausible for fiction. When we read the novels of C.S. Forester or Patrick O'Brian, when we watch the cinematic exploits of Horatio Hornblower or Jack Aubrey, we are consuming the diluted echoes of Thomas Cochrane. The author Patrick O'Brian, in creating the character of Jack Aubrey for Master and Commander, essentially transcribed Cochrane's logbooks. The capture of the Cacafuego in the novel is a direct retelling of the Speedy versus El Gamo. But even the novelists had to tone down the truth. They felt that Cochrane's actual exploits, capturing a frigate with a brig, holding off an entire army in a fortress, liberating entire nations with a handful of ships, would be rejected by readers as too fantastic to be rejected by readers as too fantastic to be believed. The truth of the Sea Wolf was simply stranger and wilder than any story a writer could invent. Driven from the service of his own country by the pettiness of the Admiralty, Cochrane did not fade into the obscurity they had planned for him. Instead, he took his genius to the New World. He became a mercenary for liberty, commanding the navies of Chile, Brazil, and later Greece in their wars of independence. He destroyed imperial fleets and toppled colonial governments, receiving the adulation of continents while he was still branded a criminal in London. It took decades for the British establishment to swallow its pride. In his old age, Queen Victoria reinstated his honours and returned his knighthood, finally acknowledging what every sailor on the lower deck had known for half a century, that he was the greatest fighting captain since Nelson. Today, Thomas Cochrane lies buried in the central nave of Westminster Abbey, surrounded by the kings and poets of the empire. His banner hangs still in the vaulted darkness, a testament to a restless spirit finally at peace. But his true monument is not in stone or brass. It remains in the enduring spirit of the underdog, in the belief that no odds are truly impossible if one has the courage to defy them. The Speedy was a vessel of wood and canvas, long since rotted away, but the shadow she cast that day in the Mediterranean stretches across the centuries. It serves as an eternal reminder that in the calculus of history, the size of the dog truly matters less than the size of the fight in the dog. Thomas Cochrane taught the world that with enough audacity, even a coffin can become a conqueror.